Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Sznycer. He is assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Montreal, Canada. He is an evolutionary social psychologist conducting research on emotion and cooperation. He has multiple lines of cross-cultural evidence on shame, pride, compassion, and envy, and their roles in altruism, cooperation, social exclusion, and conflict. He is also working to map the system that regulates how much weight one individual places on the welfare of another. And finally, he also conducts research on how these emotions and motivations regulate political and moral attitudes and how they shape communication. So, Dr. Sznycer, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, and I hope I don't butcher your last name
It's
because
fine.
it's
Yes.
a bit complicated. So, so basically today we're going to focus our conversation mostly on emotions and the evolutionary social psychology of emotions. And I mean, on my channel, I haven't yet touch too much on emotions, particularly from an evolutionary psychology perspective. I talked about emotions with some social psychologists, and I mean, there are different approaches. Some people focus, for example, on in a social context, how emotions develop and how people establish relationships with one another, and they also take into account for example, cultural aspects or cultural influences and how culture influences emotions and how we think about them and so on and so forth. So basically my first question would be, what is the approach that evolutionary psychology has to dealing with emotions?
The insight of evolutionary psychology is a general insight, namely that the only known process, naturalistic process that is able to design complexity and functional complexity other than human engineering is the process of natural selection, the process where there's variation, there's inheritance, and differences in the ability of these different variants to survive and replicate. And over evolutionary time, this cumulative process operating in particular ecologies under different selection pressures and exposed to different challenges and opportunities, this process would have created organic design that is capable and effective, efficient to replicate the underlying replicators, that is the genes. And this is true, the insight of evolutionary psychology is that this is true for the mind and the human brain, no less than for other organs, the liver, the heart, cellular machinery, and so on. And so more specifically with respect to emotions, the insight is that our forager ancestors have evolved in small-scale societies without states, without access to modern technologies, and therefore they needed to solve a number of tasks to survive and reproduce. And emotions would have solved a number of different adaptive problems that our ancestors faced that were perhaps complicated to solve by any one particular system. You need a coordination of many different systems in just the right way if you are to solve it just right. And so in one sentence, the view is that emotions are evolved programs to orchestrate many different behavioral, motivational, physiological, attentional, conceptual systems to solve complex and important adaptive problems.
Mm-hmm. So would you say then that emotions are sort of cognitive tools that we evolved during our evolutionary history to try to solve evolutionarily relevant problems that have to do with things like social coordination and establishing relationships with other people. I mean, mainly things that have to do with the social dimension of our lives as humans.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So I have pretty much nothing to add to your definition, except that there's also a number of non-social emotions that operate to solve non-social type of problems. So fear of heights, fear of predators, a number of different non-social emotions. But yes, that's exactly right, I think.
Okay, and by the way, maybe we could get a little bit more into this later in the interview, but just to get a clear sense of this from the start, how do you square off in evolutionary psychology the fact that it tends to approach human beings and their behavior and their psychology from a universal perspective? That is, it assumes that we all evolved in the same kind of social structures, and so in this case, when it comes to social emotions, throughout the world and throughout the many different societies and cultures that we have historically and even in our time, that people would have been endowed with the same basic set of emotions to solve the same basic problems. But on the other hand, isn't it also the case that at least sometimes there's some cultural variation, and I'm not sure if that also occurs at the level of emotions, but that could happen also because different groups of people were exposed to slightly different ecological conditions, and so might also have evolved somewhat different cognitive tools to deal with the same problems, let's say.
Yes, so how do you reconcile the obvious or seemingly obvious fact that there's cultural variation in behavior, in traditions, and in emotions as well? And I can give you a few examples with the theoretical and empirical, perhaps, observations that human nature would be everywhere the same. The underlying principles governing human nature might be everywhere the same because natural selection takes long amounts of time, many generations, to craft complex organisms and mechanisms. It can operate fast, tweaking some parametric things, but when it comes to building complex organs such as the vertebrate eye or complex emotions or other systems, it takes a really long time, and we spend more than 99% of our evolutionary history in small-scale bands in Africa, and so in theory the human cognitive architecture is universal. So how to reconcile these two things? To give you a couple of prominent examples in the anthropological and cross-cultural literature in emotion. So there's been people documenting cultural differences in emotion. So, for example, there's an expression of shame, embarrassment in India, where people bite their tongue like this. And there's the argument that Japan and other East Asian cultures are shame cultures as opposed to more individualistic cultures such as the United States and Europe, where these are we would be guilt cultures. There's an argument by Steve Heine and collaborators arguing that in those East Asian societies and cultures, people don't self-enhance, or they self-enhance much less, because the point is not to advertising too much how great you are. That's not good if you are in a collectivistic hierarchical society. So there's a number of very interesting claims that we need to take seriously, because these are observations. There's a recent very intriguing and fascinating report that among the Trobrianders of Papua New Guinea, when you show people pictures posing the facial expression of fear that we recognize as fear, what they see is the expression of threat from the person in the picture to you, or the expression of anger. So these are very fascinating and intriguing and interesting facts that we need to accommodate if they can be accommodated. Maybe yes, maybe not. So let me take a little roundabout to answer that question, which is that before trying to explain cultural differences in emotion, let's think a little bit about within culture operations. So the within culture naturalistic garden variety operation of a well-designed emotional system, what it would be like. And here we can invoke Chomsky's seminal and interesting idea of a system that could be hybrid. Namely, it could have universal principles and open parameters that can be calibrated by local information. So the language acquisition device presumably is similar everywhere. Children everywhere have, we humans have the system, where, however, the local input to that language acquisition device varies across societies, and so you'll end up speaking Portuguese in Portugal or English in America. Okay, so something similar, I think, is true of emotions. So work by my colleague Aaron Sell on the emotion of anger suggests the possibility that anger is an evolved program for bargaining for better treatment from others when you detect in their behavior or in other cues that they're placing insufficient weight on your welfare. They're treating you with less respect or love or liking or helpfulness that you think you deserve. And so when the anger system activates, it seems to deploy a number of bargaining tactics that are geared toward incentivizing the target of the anger to treat you better. So I don't help you as much as you think I should help you. You get angry and you tell me, "Hey, Daniel, treat me better. You issue a threat. Daniel, treat me better, or otherwise I won't help you anymore, or I can beat you up." So these are different bargaining tactics that the anger system deploys, and there's a puzzling thing or an interesting observation in the anger when you study anger closely, which is that you might think that anger and aggression go hand in hand, and the stereotypical thing that we think that anger is about is aggression. You get angry, you punch. It's the anger punch model of anger. But in reality, that model, when you look closely, is wrong, because the vast majority of the anger events don't work like that at all. What happens is you get angry and you don't punch. You might punch at some point eventually, or you may not punch at all. So why? And the animal behavior literature is extremely useful to analyze and understand the conditional behavior of the anger program, in that anger, aggression, and these kind of bargaining systems are really well designed by natural selection to be effective on the one hand, to get what the system is designed to do, but also efficiently, economically, to not waste more effort or resources or opportunity costs. When you have achieved what you need to achieve cheaply, you only spend when the low cost tactic doesn't work. So animal conflict and animal conflict is about assessment, really. So there's a strong animal and a weak animal, and they roar and or they walk parallel to each other, and they assess who is the stronger guy. And once there's clear information that this other guy is stronger than I am, I surrender the resource because it's better to get 0 out of the conflict than to get 0 plus being beaten up. So it's a very once the system establishes a difference, the system retreats. And if the parallel walk the information is noisy to establish who's the stronger one, then there's an escalation to a more reliable but costly and potentially risky assessment, such as roaring or maybe body contact or eventually getting to punches. But as soon as you establish the relevant thing, you withdraw. So with the anger, the human anger system appears to work in pretty much the same way. So if you feel that I didn't help you as much as you think I should have, if you punch me, that's dangerous because we can get into a fight, and that can be very risky physically, but also you might lose a valuable social relationship that would have been easy to recalibrate and to change by simply telling me, hey, Daniel, what are you doing? I'm always there for you, and you're not helping me. So come on, man. And I say, oh, you're right. You're exactly right. I'm really sorry. I had to bring my child to a doctor or to the circus, and I tell my child that in the past circuses had animals and lions and stuff, and she doesn't believe me. But anyway, okay, I'm sorry. I'm gonna help you more. You're entirely right, and the conflict is completely solvable in extremely cost-effective way. So punching is the exactly wrong way to go about to solve the anger problem, or that the problem that the anger system is by hypothesis designed to solve. So these the anger system and other systems appear to be exquisitely well calibrated to operate conditionally and to select behavioral and other outputs conditionally on the demands that the contexts tell you. And so with this within culture example of the anger system, and I can give you other examples in other emotions. So to give you a fun example, I think intuitive and evocative example in the one emotion that I work, the emotion of shame, people say the emotion of shame, one of the things it does is it gives the characteristic shame display, slump posture, gaze avoidance. It's a display of appeasement that what it does is also in animal conflict, it deters further attack. So I signal that I submit, that I want, that I acknowledge my lower rank or my lower entitlement to good treatment on your end, and therefore I acknowledge my misdeed. I'm sorry, I'm going to be nicer to you, and that's it. So again, that's a little bit like the anger punch model of anger, because the reality is that shame sometimes produces the shame display, but sometimes doesn't produce the shame display. And not only that, but sometimes producing the shame display, if the shame system produced the shame display, that would be completely wrong way to proceed. Because, for example, if you're doing a disreputable action in private, in your office, let's say, and you hear people approaching down the corridor, okay, and close to approaching to your office, if you then give them the shame display, for example, that might be okay. And the other thing to say is that the hypothesized function of shame is to minimize the likelihood and also the costs of being devalued by others when other people find negative information about you. Okay, so the anger, the shame system, and I can talk little bit about shame, does many interesting things to save face in one phrase. But if you were to give the shame display, for example, in this situation, as the people enter the room, that may be completely counterproductive, because you are, in fact, advertising and telling people that you have something that you're guilty about. Mm-hmm. So that's not the way to act. And this is not about normative or prescriptive. This is an engineering analysis of what a well-designed shame system that is really tailored to minimize devaluation should do. So perhaps the best response in that particular context is to simply feign normalcy, that to pretend that nothing happened. You stop doing the disreputable action. You go with the proverbial, I don't know if in Portugal you guys have the and that's it. So I don't know if this is true in general. I don't do that myself, but people tell me that they do it. Anyway, so we need more research, and we need more funding to see if this question is in general right. But anyway, the point is that this level exquisite and context-specific degree of conditional calibration of emotional systems, not across cultures. Forget about cultures. It's within a given culture, within the same person, moment to moment, context to context. These systems, if they're well designed to weather different challenges and opportunities in different circumstances, and they should be designed to act to select various different means in the right way, but the goal should always be the same. Mm-hmm. So it's a means to ends analysis and conditional selection of outputs. So I think that these within culture logic mm-hmm. Of emotions, where they might have universal fixed and really invariant principles, plus open parameters that are open to the local group and also the local moment-to-moment context, could very well, in theory at least, and perhaps in practice in some cases, although that's an empirical question that remains to be determined, could very well explain cultural differences in emotion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I understand. So let me just ask you this. You referred to how emotions like anger and shame work. Is it the case that there's a basic set or a set of basic emotions that we've already identified, or not?
The concept of basic emotion is a very interesting concept, very helpful, developed by Paul Ekman, geared towards separating affective and picking affective phenomena, emotional affective phenomena, from other types of affective phenomena, such as moods that are longer lasting and so on. And Ekman and others, they had the view that, similar to the story that I've been telling you about, emotions are programs, discrete programs instantiated in neural tissue. They have evolved by the evolutionary process. They are universal, found everywhere, and different to moods, they appear quick and they last relatively brief amounts of time. How much exactly we don't know, but in the order of seconds or minutes, but not weeks. And they have distinct developmental pathways, and they might be present in primates, and they have specific antecedent events and specific appraisals interpretation. So there's the actual event in the world and how the organism interprets that event. These should be perhaps related, but these are not the same thing. So if there's a lion and you don't interpret the situation as being dangerous, you're lion food, and the emotion didn't appraise the situation correctly for various reasons. And okay, and also there's, in the Ekman scheme, there's distinct expressions of the emotions, communication, and physiological signatures, and so on. So that's a very interesting approach, very helpful, and it spurred massive amounts of research, really productive research. The discovery that facial expression of emotions might be universal. His pioneering work in Papua New Guinea, showing that people in a very remote culture can tell from the face, can match situations to facial expressions the way that we would do, Westerners living in the West. But there's a number of issues that there's a few things with the notion of basic emotion. So, for example, if you require that a human emotion also happens in our primate cousins, then that by fiat and a priori, that disallows the possibility that we humans might have emotions, or basic or non-basic, that primates don't have, or emotional variants of the program. That so primates might have the anger program, but in a different version than we do. And so, and other issues, other potential issues. The notion that an expression to be, an emotion to be basic and therefore genuine and real has to have an expression. Well, natural selection might have added expressions to those emotions that might be profitable to communicate over evolutionary time. But there might be emotions where the expression of the emotional state might be not good. So envy, people don't like to be around envious people for good reasons, and therefore if you give away your so I talked about giving away your shame, internal state. Now we can think about giving away your envy, internal state. That's not good. That's also self-defeating. Envy is an emotion that is stealthy, malicious, but critically stealthy. No one says that we don't say that we're envious. We say that we're jealous, that we're envious, but in a good way. And so it would be perhaps very bad if the envy emotion that is, there's a lot of research, interesting research on envy, and it seems systematic and complex and doing interesting, perhaps functional stuff. But it might be self-defeating for the envy emotion to broadcast the internal envy state. And therefore, for these reasons, I think some tweaks on the Ekman theory might be in order. I think the general approach is great, but the way that I would proceed in order to know or to discover if some emotion or some emotions are genuine, real, existing in the human mind and brain, is to proceed with task analysis of the adaptive problems our human ancestors would have had to solve in their local ancestral ecologies, and the usual toolkit in the evolutionary psychology toolkit, hunter-gatherer studies, cognitive, economics, everything, to really know and find out if something is an emotion, without necessarily respecting. So I think the Ekman paradigm is a great heuristic guide, but you don't have to necessarily respect each clause. So I think that would be a basic emotion program adapted to now, maybe, or to how I would and how I do my research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just ask you now about a paper that you published recently this year titled The Emotion Valuation Constellation. Multiple emotions are governed by a common grammar of social valuation. So this is very interesting. I'm not going to read the entire abstract, but basically you and your colleagues conducted some experiments in the United States and India that indicated that 5 different social emotions all track a common set of valuations. And you say also that the extent to which people value each of 25 positive characteristics that you can talk about in others predict the intensities of 5 different emotions that you talk about here, that are pride, anger, gratitude, guilt, and sadness. So could you tell us about that, about what's the basic premise behind the paper, perhaps explain the notion of social valuation and what you mean by a common grammar of social valuation, and then the specific emotions that you studied there?
Yeah, so John Tooby and Lida Cosmides started a research program in the early 2000s or even earlier, and other people as well, suggesting the possibility that a number of emotions, the social emotions, for example, one critical thing that they do is they act as recalibrational machines. And what they recalibrate is, the hypothesis is that they recalibrate variables, knobs variables that index how much people value others. You value others a lot or less or nothing, or maybe negatively. So an enemy is someone that you value negatively. Okay. And not only, so the emotions in your head, what they would do is they reach out with their emotions have hands. Okay, so they reach out into the regulatory variable for valuing others, and they may increase their value. So, for example, we talked a little bit about anger. So you're angry at me. I am guilty, or I discovered that I've done something wrong, and so I placed too little weight on your welfare. You're my friend. I treated you poorly. I should have treated you better. So the guilt, the emotion of guilt with the hand, reaches into this variable and dials it up so that in the future I am more willing to help you. And the other thing that emotions do similarly is with their hands, because emotions have hands, is to reach metaphorically into the brain of other people and attempt to dial these variables for valuation up or down, generally up. So in the case of your anger, what your anger does is it deploys a number of behavioral tactics on your end in order to eventually increase my valuation knob. So in one sentence, the argument is that social emotions recalibrate variables for valuing others. So, for example, anger, trying to increase how much I value you, guilt upon detection that I imposed undue costs on a person that I love, increasing my own valuation of them, shame, preventing others from devaluing me if they detect negative information about me, the emotion of pride, advertising great or less than great successes that you have so that other people learn about these things. It's advertisement, and it's not only advertisement, it's also reaching into the brain of others and demanding or hoping or incentivizing that they increase their valuation towards you when you're proud of something. gratitude if I treat you better than you anticipated that I would treat you. Oh, thank you thank you very much, you tell me. But also the gratitude system reaches with the hand, dials the valuation up to cement a cooperative relationship. So, and there's an extremely interesting and complicated and complex and rich psychology for valuing others. The social value of people is determined in many different ways. So people can be more or less attractive as mates, romantic mates, and that is determined by a number of specific physiological or morphological behavioral properties. But they might also be more or less valuable as friends, as cooperation partners, as coalitionary allies, and the valuation criteria for all these different things might be similar, but might be interestingly different too. So there's very sophisticated machinery. There's work, a lot of work now, looking at the domain-specific logic of valuation. What counts as being valuable or disvaluable in different domains. So it's a very rich psychology. So, but now we can black box all that rich psychology of valuation a little bit, and now think that there's a machine in the black box machine in the head for computing the value of self and others, and then there's these different social emotions that in theory what they do is with their hands dial these valuation knobs up or down, and different people in your social world might have different social values. So you value your friend more than you value a stranger in the street, and which in turn you value more than an enemy, and so on, a rival. So if the 2B Cosmis, one implication of the 2B Cosmis theory of social emotions as recalibrators of social valuation is that all of these different emotions, even though they do very different things, right? Anger incentivizes me to treat you better, gratitude treat you better, shame, avoiding, etc. Even though these emotions do very different things, nevertheless, if all these emotions act on and recalibrate social valuation, then we might find a signature or evidence that this is in fact the case. That is to say that all these emotions rely on one and the same valuation architecture. Mm-hmm. So the way I did it with my Aaron Lukashevsky is to say, okay, so imagine 25 different positive actions or traits that people might do or have. So winning a marathon, being athletic, being able to defend yourself, cowardly, taking up punches, intellectual, following social norms, you name it. Mm-hmm. And there's a common grammar. It computes kind of a the grammar of social valuation prices it's a price list of all these actions in your is 5 units of good, and being athletic might be 3.5 units of good, and so on. And so that is true in linguistics and philosophy, and in is that you can have a concatenation of one embedded in another. So, for example, if you're great at running marathons, you are pride, okay? But now imagine that you are great at running marathons, and other people, your friends, they don't acknowledge that you're really athletic and that you're really a great marathonist. So that meets the input conditions of the anger system, because the deep meaning of that is your social value is high because you won the marathon, and by not acknowledging that you won the marathon, then people in your social ecology might treat you less well than what they would treat you if they did acknowledge that you won the marathon. So the anger system should be activated, or might be activated. And similarly, imagine that a friend of yours spreads positive gossip about you and is your kind of PR agent and convinces other people that you are a great marathonist. Oh, that's great. He tweets about your great marathon, so you are grateful to him for his great PR. So the rationale here is that you can embed actions, the value of different actions and traits in you can have the different actions and traits, and you can concatenate them with other conceptual structure such that those things might meet the input conditions of anger or gratitude or guilt or sadness or pride. And I'm talking too much, but I should give you the one sentence summary. It is that the extent to which people socially value someone, if that someone were athletic, generous, this and that, for each of these items we have how valuable this is in people's psychology. It is the case that the anger system, the intensity of the anger system moves up or down in precise lockstep with the actual social value of those things if people don't acknowledge that those things are true of you. So let me say it now in one sentence. The more people value a characteristic in a given social group, in others, it is the case that the more anger you feel if other people don't acknowledge that that is true of you, the more pride you feel if that is true of you, the more gratitude you feel if a friend convinces others that this is true of you, the more guilt you feel if this is true of you, if this is true of someone on whom you have imposed costs, and that's the input condition of guilt. So this evidence supports the Tooby and Cosmides conjecture that many different social emotions, they all constellate and they all talk to and recalibrate social values.
I understand.
And yes.
Yes, so I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, but let me just ask you this. So I think I understand all of what you've just said. So, but since basically emotions are mental programs that we've evolved in order to make social valuation and to evaluate, in this case, the characteristics of other people and our own, and to decide how to establish relationships of different sorts with other people. Do you know if, from an historical evolutionary perspective, let's say, if it would make more sense for us to first have evolved our sociality, that is, the ways by which we as humans establish relationships with other people, and then only after that to evolve the proper emotions to regulate those same relationships, or the other way around, that is, the emotions came first during our evolution and only with them in place we were able to develop or to evolve our sociality?
It's an interesting chicken and egg question.
Right.
The general, I think that the two things are true. It's a little bit like the culture or universal. The two things are true. You need ecological selection pressures of some type, ecological or informational, or some type of selection pressure, and you can call that the environment. Although you're talking about sociality, but there's other types of environment, physical environment. But you need some kind of environmental property in order for cognition to evolve, or for anything to evolve. But on the other hand, it's also true that sociality as we know it is enabled by the mental mechanisms that we have, because tables don't have mental mechanisms as far as we know, and they don't have any sociality, or chimps have different mental mechanisms and they have different types of sociality. So I think one general and brief answer to this question is that it's a mutually ratcheting process. There's two things going on. Perhaps a prime mover is some ecological change, but there's an interaction between these two processes. So external social factors, socio-ecological factors shape minds, and in turn, minds shape or make societies, as the title of a recent book by Pascal Boyer, which is great, on how complex social phenomena can be traced to properties of individual brains. And this is this leads me to tell you about a project that I'm very excited about with my collaborator Carlton Patrick. The signature of human social valuation and emotion is really it's observed very widely across human societies and also in time. So I have a paper published, two papers published in 2008 on pride and shame. We and a team of collaborators, psychologists and anthropologists, went to 10 and 15 small-scale traditional societies around the world, very remote places, hunter-gatherers in Uganda, and pastoralists in Mongolia, and hunter-horticulturalists in the Ecuadorian Amazon, very, very remote places, off the grid. Many of these places, they don't read or write. And what we found is that in all of these places, there's massive, within culture and also across cultures, commonalities in the way the shame system and also the pride system interface with the system of valuation. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but people rank order how worse is it to be a thief than it is to lack skills, for example. And people rank the badness of these social traits or the goodness of positive traits, and they rank these things in very, very highly consistent ways across all these 15 traditional small-scale societies. It's really spooky because we cannot definitively rule out that some Western influence conveyed to the Shuar and to Mongolians and to people in the island of Mauritius what they should say and Western values. We cannot for sure absolutely rule out that alternative hypothesis, but it's strongly suggestive that there might be something about human nature that rank orders the goodness or the badness of positive or negative social things, and that again these things interface very lawfully and functionally with social emotions. Mm-hmm. And an outcrop of this project is with my collaborator Carlton Patrick. Mm-hmm. We found signatures of the social valuation and social emotion systems mm-hmm. in the law, in the origin of laws. So at their core, laws are about conflicts of interest. There's no conflict for the law to redress if there's no conflict of interest, or if there's some conflict of interest, but the cheaper alternative is to just figure it out among friends. We don't go to the court if we can sort out our problems. But conflicts of interest would have selected over evolutionary time an array of adaptations to minimize the likelihood and cost of being victimized. So we think that, and other people too before us made the argument that when you look beneath the hood of the law and morality, justice, these are, underlying these things are mental mechanisms that are universal. Mm-hmm. So this is unlike the theory that God gave us the laws, or that culturally specific social norms are behind the laws, or even that the expertise of lawmakers with the specific technical expertise gave us the law. So what we did is and there's been some interesting and valuable cross-cultural evidence that people across cultures have similar justice intuitions of what is more or less bad. For example, homicide is seen as more bad than theft, for example, across cultures, across some cultures. And these things they predict lawfully the legal punishments that are actually provided for those crime or offenses. But so far, the evidence was collected, came from Western so-called weird societies, Western educated, industrialized, democratic societies. Mm-hmm. And so a potential alternative hypothesis of this universalist theory of the origin of laws, which has been posited actually by other people, is that, well, justice intuitions and laws actually come from culture, because it's again the same antinomy. There's universalism, but there's also cultural differences. So which one is true? It is also true that the laws of other cultures might be very different from the laws of our culture. So what we did is we collected, so to disambiguate and to resolve this confound that all of the studies were conducted in weird societies, we collected the most ancient laws that humanity has. These are laws that originate in ancient Mesopotamia, 4,000 years old. Was cousin of the famous Hammurabi Code, 200 years older than the Hammurabi Code. This is a Sumerian society, for example, that provides laws and punishments for very different crimes that are very different from accustomed to. So there are slaves in that society, and if you kill a slave, you have to pay some number of shekels of silver. If you have an ox, and the ox is aggressive, and the government tells you to keep your ox in check, and you don't, and the ox eventually runs some other amount of shekels of silver. And what we did is we simply asked people, modern people, how bad is this thing? How bad is for your ox to run away and to kill some other people? How bad it is for you if you killed your slave, even though the slave hasn't done anything. And obviously and thankfully, we don't have slaves now. But nevertheless, the question is, would lay people with no explicit knowledge of these laws that are extremely remote and culturally different, would they be able to recreate extremely foreign laws without explicit knowledge? And the answer is that yes, they can. So they can with their social valuation system. So they see someone else who performs these actions as more or less negative in a way that meshes with the actual punishments provided by the Shnuna laws 4,000 years ago. And it's also true for the social emotions. So if you yourself committed these actions, then your shame is very closely correlated with the actual punishments provided for these actions by the Schnuna laws 4,000 years ago. So to sum up, if I could sum this up in a sentence, it's been a challenge for me, as you can tell. Talk, and I like to talk.
No problem at all.
So in one sentence, there's very profound implications, and there's really deep universality, I think, for the law, for morality, for justice, that these social valuation and social emotions have, not only for interpersonal relationships, but also for a lot of other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So, and would you say that these commonalities that you find cross-culturally in terms of how people evaluate other people's behavior and other people's traits, let's say, that it all stems from that common basis, that is that cross-culturally people tend to evaluate the same traits and the same behaviors in somewhat similar ways? Is that it?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, I was asking if then these commonalities that you found cross-culturally in terms of how people think about other people's behaviors and how they evaluate other people's characteristics, that then it is the case that cross-culturally people tend to evaluate as good or bad the same types of behaviors and traits from other people, right?
That's what we see. Mm-hmm. And again, there's always, as scientists, we need to be careful, and we don't like to say this proves something because of, there's a problem of induction, and there's a good reason to be careful and circumspect about the claims that you make. So there's always many different alternative hypotheses, and they're logically possible and even empirically possible. But it's also the case that there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence in support of the hypothesis of universality, at least in the principles and in the nature of the open parameters. And of course, different local situations, not only across cultures, but even, as I said before, even moment to moment in your life, there's going to be many different local circumstances that will require different parameterizations, and therefore there's different circumstances in different places of the world. We are obviously aware of this fact, and we acknowledge this fact. But I think that a hybrid Chomsky-like architecture of principles and parameters could explain the mysteries and the details of universality in emotion, and also so-called cultural differences in emotion, or ecological differences in emotion.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a bit worried about the time now. I don't know if you have much more time, but perhaps let me just ask you one final question. We've already talked a lot about several different emotions here today and how people deal with them and their functions and etc. So, when you refer to these emotions and how they affect people, are you interested mostly in, let's say, emotions being the way we extract information from?
Sorry, it froze a little bit. Could you repeat?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was asking if when you talk about emotions in your work, if you're interested more in emotions as brain programs, let's say, where people extract information from the environment and then process it, and then usually get an output in terms of behavior,
yes,
or in terms of how they think of other people and things like that, or if you're also interested in the more subjective aspect of it in terms of how people consciously experience that feeling that usually comes together with the emotion. You know, for example, when we feel anger, there's that subjective feeling. You know, so are you also interested in that in your work, or not?
Yes, I'm interested in everything. So consciousness is the tip of the iceberg. There's a massive amount of hugely complex computation that happens below the tip of the iceberg. So I'm interested in the nature, the information processing nature of those computations beneath the tip of the iceberg. And I'm also interested in the conscious phenomenology of these emotions. And in fact, there's a very rich and interesting tradition in social psychology, attributional theories, in trying to explain shame and guilt, for example, and many other emotions by their phenomenology. So John Tangney, Jess Tracy have very interesting research trying to contrast the phenomenology of shame and guilt. So shame feels about yourself. It's about the self. It's about something uncontrollable that you cannot control. Whereas guilt is more about the action, that you blame the action for the negative event, and it's more repairable and controllable. And the argument is that these phenomenological differences between shame and guilt are the reason why, given the relative substitutability of shame and guilt, when you mess up, shame reacts. When you feel shame, you react in negative ways. You hide, you blame other people, because it's really painful to blame the self, whereas guilt makes you apologize and make up and act in more pro-social ways, because it's a lighter phenomenological feeling. So I think that's extremely interesting, but I think that an interpersonal functional approach to these emotions and other emotions can explain. They are very useful because they allow you to, in principle, map beneath the iceberg the computational structure, and they and that explanation, those hypotheses, have implications for trying to understand the conscious phenomenology of why shame and guilt feel the way that they do from a functional interpersonal perspective. And I have a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences explaining how can we explain phenomenology using this interpersonal functional approach. But probably we need to wrap up, maybe.
Yeah. So just quickly, do you think then that the subjective feeling that accompanies the emotion, let's say, and the conscious aspect of it, that it has some sort of causal power over our behavior? I mean, do you think that if people didn't experience these subjective feelings, that they would behave in the same way just by being compelled by the computational aspect of the emotion?
Yes. I think that neuroscience tells us that the mechanistic story is the correct one, and the conscious phenomenology may come later. And I don't want to say that it's a mere byproduct, an artifact, but it may have useful functions. But you could understand the internal phenomenological felt signal of the emotion in functional terms too. Mm-hmm. And so Tooby and Kosmis and other people have proposed that conscious phenomenology might be a format of some information that is broadcast by the mind to many other mechanisms, and this is a format that it's a particular format that when it's broadly broadcasted, you feel it, but there's a lot of computation that happens beneath the surface, and so I have worked on the felt magnitude of shame and pride, how that tells the organism how much other people will devalue them if they perform, for example, killing versus a minor infraction, and that may help the organism take action in the right way. But the brief answer is that I think zombies could be perfectly functional or zombies, I don't know, mechanistic automatons. If we didn't have the conscious feelings, we would be perfectly functional in the world. But we do have those feelings, and it's not entirely clear why. There's some hypotheses, and more research and, importantly, more funding is needed to understand why.
Yeah, sure. So let's wrap up the interview then, Dr. Sznycer. Before we go, would you like to tell people what are the easiest places on the internet for them to find your work?
Yes, my work is at danielsznycer.org. Daniel SZNYCER.org. The information is there, my papers and other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving a link to that in the description box of the interview, Dr. Sznycer. And again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was really a pleasure to talk to you.
The pleasure was all mine. It was fantastic to talk with you. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, I also have a PayPal and Subscribestar. And if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, and Dr. Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, and Rutger Voss, and also my three producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.